a little bit, but so welcome. My name is Jared. I'm with Pillar to Post Home Inspectors, and so my team covers primarily Utah County, but we'll go north up to Layton, down to Manti. So most of the Wasatch Front. There's another office for Pillar to Post in Salt Lake, another one in Park City, and another one down in Cedar City. So that's probably one of the biggest things with Pillar to Post is we interact a lot. So I've got 3 guys on my team, and we all have different experiences. One guy was an electrician for 7 or 8 years. Another guy did radon mitigation for 10 years. One guy did mold remediation for several years. So we have so we're constantly, hey, what do you think about this? So you're getting a little bit more mind share. And then when we don't have the answers, we reach out to some of the other guys. So there's about 20 Pillar to Post inspectors throughout the state. And I love to help you guys out with and help your buyers. The class we're going to do today is on radon, and it's something that we get lots of questions, and lately we've been getting even more questions about radon, and there's a lot of companies. In fact, I just heard about another one of the inspectors here locally that has actually started doing radon mitigation, and there's so much radon, he's doing more mitigation than he's doing inspections. That's kind of become his primary business. There's a lot of mitigation companies that are pushing and offering free testing, and that's where a lot of and that's actually kind of how this class came about. Is we had a lot of questions from one of the agents here in the office and said, hey, we need to learn more about this because we're constantly getting questions. So we'll talk about some of those questions and myths and misinformation that gets put out there a lot, and talk about that. How long, Sherry, have you been in real estate for less than 5 years or more than 5 years?
Less. So I'm going on my 5th year.
Okay, great. How about you, Rod?
Yeah, 10-ish years.
Okay, great. So I started doing home inspections in 2006. And back then, radon, I would occasionally get a request for a radon test. It was usually from someone out of state. For that first year or 2 that I was doing inspections, I just outsourced it. There was a local company. There were hardly even any mitigators, but there was one company, he actually did more soil engineering and kind of did radon as a side business because there just wasn't that much demand. Where today, it's between 30 and 40% of our inspections include a radon test. So the awareness is a lot more. We'll talk a little bit more just about the data that we have. There's a lot more out there. Just to kind of go through our course, this is kind of what we're going to talk about in the class. What is radon and where does it come from? What does it do to your house? What the levels mean and which ones are dangerous? How you test for radon, and then how you take care of it. So quite a lot of information for, to pack into a 1-hour class, but we'll cruise through this. And if you do have questions, just since this is a smaller group and I can kind of watch too, either just post them in the chat and Tana will read them over, or you could use the little raise your hand icon, or just with this small of a group, just unmute yourself and interrupt me. I'm fine with that. So what is radon? What are the different levels? Sorry, what I'm going between 2 different screens here, the screen that you guys see and the screen that I see here. So radon is a radioactive gas. It's a gas that comes out of the ground. It's everywhere. So you're breathing radon right now. It's everywhere in our atmosphere. It comes from uranium. So uranium, that's everywhere. Trace amounts of uranium are all throughout the world. As it breaks down, radon is one of those byproducts. So some scientists have just speculated that if you were to take a dump truck worth of soil from anywhere on the planet, on average, you would have about a half a teaspoon of uranium. So obviously that's not everywhere. We have parts of Utah where they actually have mined uranium. So those places, it's a lot more concentrated. And that's also one of those reasons why we do see a lot more radon here in Utah. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of how many homes and what the distribution is. If you recall back to junior high high school physics and chemistry, you talked about how molecules, how different elements will break down. And that's what causes radioactivity. And actually uranium breaks down to radium, which breaks down to radon. And eventually that just keeps going down and breaking down. And every time that atom that breaks down, radiation is given off. And so it's not so much that the radon is bad, but the radon only has a half-life of about 2.5 days. And so that radon atom breaks down and gives off alpha particles. And it's those alpha particles that can cause damage. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. It is considered a human carcinogen, meaning it causes cancer. And it's associated with the leading cause of lung cancer after smoking. So it is something that that has gotten a lot more attention, especially in the last few decades, as more and more people are aware of the hazards of smoking, but we're still seeing significant numbers of lung cancer. And that's where it spawned a lot more awareness and education and research. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. There's your first keyword. So go ahead and write that down. Again, at the end of the class, there'll be a form. You can plug in those keywords along with your license number and name and stuff so we can get you credit. So radon is this atom floating around. It gets into our lungs. As that radon breaks down, it gives off alpha particles, and that's why it's damaging to our lung tissue. Alpha particles aren't that dangerous except to soft and sensitive tissue like your lung tissue. And so that's where you can over time start to develop lung cancer. The reason why we're starting to see more of it too in our homes in the last few decades is we've made a bigger effort to make our homes more airtight, more energy efficient. We'll talk a lot about just some of the myths that I've heard over the years in this industry. And one of them is, oh, it's a new home, you don't need to worry about it. And it's actually the opposite is true. If a home is newer, it actually is going to be more airtight. And as that radon comes out of the ground, we'll talk a little bit more about how it gets into our homes. But as it gets into our homes, if you had an old drafty house, it's going to get into your home and go back out. But if you have a good, tight, sealed up home, that's where it gets in and it starts to accumulate. And that's where we have more problems. So a newer home tends to have more radon potentially problems. I don't know if you guys can see this on your screen. This was just something someone sent me that I thought was interesting, because another myth that I've heard over the years is, that some studies have shown that small amounts of radon are actually healthy for you. That's the myth. And that's a myth that's been going around since the turn of the century. This was so you've probably seen these seltzer bottles. They carbonate water. Well, back in the 30s, they would sell, instead of a carbon dioxide bulb that would carbonate the water, it was actually one full of radon. And part of this came about is there were these health spas, with hot springs and natural spas around the country, around the world, where people would go, and there were curative properties. So people would go to these places when they had illnesses and doctors couldn't really figure out, and they would go to these health spas and they'd become cured. And some of them were the radium caves. So we're around the world, there were several places where there were radium caves with high levels of radium, which then breaks down to radon. And as you'd sit in these caves for a certain amount of time over the week, a lot of people claimed that they would get healed. I guess the easiest way to explain and kind of my contradiction to that claim that a little bit of radon is good. Those radium caves, there is a lot of evidence that it did cause people to heal and get over their illnesses. But it's a lot like my wife went through chemo, breast cancer several years ago, and learned a lot about chemo and how it works. And it's kind of that same concept that chemo is not good for your body, but given in certain doses, it does kick your immune system and help your body fight off cancer cells and help you heal in most cases, or in many cases. And that's kind of what they suspect happens in a lot of these radium caves, is your body is kind of inundated, and your body's immune system kind of goes into overdrive, and hopefully you kick that whatever is ailing you and you can get healthier. So the claim that a small amount of radon over a long period of time is kind of like saying, yeah, well, chemo healed my wife and got rid of her cancer, so we should all be on a little bit of chemo every day because that will help prevent cancer. That's kind of using the same logic that these people, the arguments that I've read and research where they say a little bit of radon is good. So bottom line, yeah, that's one of those statements, those myths that I don't give a whole lot of credibility to. Radon is measured in picocuries. So a curie is a measurement of radioactive decay. And so as an atom breaks down, gives off radiation, it's measured in curies. A picocurie is a fraction of that. And so you're looking at how much radioactivity is happening in a volume, in this case, a liter. So that's, if you can see on the screen, the PCI/L, that's picocuries per liter. You don't need to really remember that. It doesn't really matter. Just when you see that annotation, that's what we're talking about. Average indoor level is 1.2 on the previous slide. Average outdoor level is 0.3. So like I said before, there's radon everywhere in our atmosphere. We're all breathing it. It's just when it gets into higher concentrations over long periods of time, that's where we start seeing the health hazards. There's a lot of ways that radon gets into the home, and it is coming out of the ground. So just another myth, another bad information is, well, the home doesn't have a basement, so we don't need to worry about radon. There's a little bit of truth in that because radon is coming from the ground. And so if you have a full basement, you have 5 surface areas in contact with the ground, where if you just have a slab, then you just have 1 surface area. And so, yes, a basement has a lot more area in contact with the soil where that radon is coming out of. But just because it doesn't have a basement doesn't mean you don't have a home that could have radon. So we found many homes that are on crawl spaces or on a slab and they have high radon. So yes, a basement is more likely to have radon, but just because it doesn't have a basement doesn't mean they don't have to worry about radon. In fact, and I haven't run into this here in Utah, but I have a friend who does home inspections over in Indiana. And he was saying that there are parts in his area that he covers where you can set up a radon monitor and test just in a backyard. And there's so much radon coming out of the ground that just even in the backyard, you can get high readings. So, that's not even a basement or a slab. Just on that note, crawl spaces are kind of interesting because the whole idea with a crawl space is there's this big cavity underneath your home that's usually completely open to the ground. And so with crawl spaces, it can kind of go either way on the extremes. On the one hand, you have a full opening. It's not even like a gas trying to get through little cracks in the slab and the foundation. It's just the open dirt. But on the other hand, you have a lot of most crawl spaces are vented. So they're designed so that if moisture and humidity that comes out of the ground gets into that crawl space, it can vent out. So a lot of cases, if it's venting properly, that radon should be venting out to the outside and not really getting to your home. And so crawl space can kind of go either way. So again, when it's getting into the house, there's all kinds of gaps. It's a gas. And so it doesn't need that much, of an entry point. So just, I'm sure, if you've been fortunate enough to be in a basement that doesn't have any cracks, good for you. It doesn't really happen. But those cracks, that's where radon is going to be coming through. All right, hold on. I lost my pointer here. There we go. So one of the ways or things that can really causes it to come into the house is something called the stack effect. So you've heard the term a smokestack. Well, the stack, and comes from that same terminology, the smokestack. As air heats up, it rises. And so that's why a chimney works, is that carries that smoke and everything out. The taller that chimney, for example, if you have a fireplace that smoke is constantly coming out, it doesn't draft very well. One of the ways that they fix that is by extending the height of a chimney. And that will help draw the smoke up the chimney more than letting it come back into your home. So the same concept happens with a home. So in some cases, a home like a tall townhouse, a 3-story townhouse, might have more of a propensity for radon than a rambler, because you have that tall structure where warm air is rising. And as that warm air rises, the lower level, the basement or the main level actually has a negative pressure. So there's a suction, and it will draw that radon out of the ground to those other levels. One of my employees at one time, she had high radon in her home. So in between when she discovered that, and then she was getting her system, her house taken care of, we took advantage, and we did a lot of just experimenting with our testing equipment. And so we'd set it up on one side of the basement versus the other on the different levels of the home. And the thing that was most surprising was when she left the radon monitor running in the basement, but then slept with the upstairs windows open. And that, again, with this stack effect, caused way more warm air to rise and go out of the house. And so the radon levels actually tripled during that night compared to other nights, just because of that stack effect. You also have other depressurization. So other things where the volume of air in the house gets vented to the outside. And so that causes a depressurization, which results in a suction where it will draw gases out of the ground. So you have your clothes dryers, your bathroom exhaust fans, central vacs, all of those types of systems are sucking air from the home and venting it to the outside. And that makeup air, and that's why I say, especially with newer homes that are designed a lot more airtight, you're going to see more of this depressurization. Even if you were to have the miraculous concrete guy that built you a full basement without any cracks in the concrete, you still have just the way that slabs and foundations and footings are poured, that you're going to have that crack around the perimeter where those different components meet up. It's a total sealed system. It's just another visual, but also to highlight that one other way that radon can get into a home is if you guys do any work with homes that are in rural areas on a well, radon can be carried in water. And so as you are showering, running the faucet, that radon then re-aerosolizes and can get into a home. So where that would be applicable is if you were, say, selling a home, and it's a home down in Sanpete County, for example, down Indianola, Fairview. Sanpete County has a lot of radon. Most of those homes test high. And let's say it was a vacant home on a well. You do a traditional radon test, which is testing the air, and it comes back not very high. They move in, and while they're living there, they decide to do another test down the road, and it comes back super high. And that could be a result of just in the course of using water, if there's a high level of radon in the water, through showering, bathing, cooking, all of that gets re-aerosolized, and that could be adding radon into the air. So there are other types of tests where you can actually sample the water and test for radon that way. So let's talk about the levels. Indoor level is 1.2. It ranges between 0.8 and 2.7 is what most studies show. That's kind of the average for indoor levels. There's an action level, which is 4.0. And then if you were to get remediation done, they should be trying to get it below 2. The action level is the one that we, you've heard a lot about. And again, another myth or bad information is, what's the legal limit? And in Utah, there is no legalities when it comes to radon. So, so one question that I'll sometimes get from agents is, well, it came back at 3.9, so we don't have to negotiate it. Well, there really is no right or wrong level, and everything is negotiable. But the action level is 4.0. We're going to talk a little bit more of how those levels, what those numbers mean to the occupant of the person living in the home. But 4.0 is what the EPA has established as the action level, where they recommend that a system, that action be taken. About 10, 12 years ago, the World Health Organization did a big study. Well, let me back up. So most of the data that we have for the risks with radon comes about by a lot of studies that the EPA did. And a lot of that was done with miners. So people that were mining underground, and because they represented the perfect sample group, because Here they had a group of people, and because of records and safety records that were set up with the mining company, they had all of the data. They knew exactly what these miners were exposed to for exactly how many hours every day, over how many years. And then they followed them over the next several decades, and they were able to extrapolate, okay, if you've been exposed to this much radon, this is your likelihood for getting lung cancer. So for many years, one of the controversies with radon was that data is not very representative of the typical homeowner, and the data was skewed, and so it wasn't very reliable. So the World Health Organization concluded their study, and I want to say it went on for 40 plus years, and they were actually doing the same type of study, but actually monitoring and tracking just homeowners that had lived in the same house. They knew exactly what the radon levels were. And what's interesting is they came out with new recommendations. This was about 10 years ago, 2012, I think, is when all the studies finally came out. And their action level was actually 2.7. So one of the other arguments, I don't ever hear this, but I heard this a lot when I first started doing inspections, was, oh, the EPA is overly conservative. 4.0 is not really that dangerous. And part of the argument came because Canada at that time, they weren't using picocuries. They use a different system called becquerels. But basically, Canada, for example, their action level was around 30 picocuries. And so people were, that's, of course, yeah, Canada, they're totally safe at 30, and the US, we aren't safe unless we're at 4. Well, now Europe is not safe if it's over 2.7. So again, we keep getting more and more stringent on what's acceptable. I'm kind of emphasizing this because this is one of the big issues that I've been getting lots of calls and people reach out to me. A lot of these companies, there's a few companies, I don't know which ones they are, but they're mitigation companies, and they offer free testing. There's a few of them that do it well, and then there's a bunch of others that aren't. And so one of the most recent discussions I had was, it was a landlord or a property manager, and she was dealing with a tenant who had done a free test with one of these companies. And one of these companies presented the tenant with a bunch of literature where the number came back around 3, and presented this tenant with a bunch of literature published by the World Health Organization saying how dangerous 3 was, and you have to take action. You've got to do all of this stuff, and kind of using scare tactics to sell on a system. Well, she's just the tenant. So again, she starts raising all these red flags with the landlord, with the property management company, and kind of things get blown out of proportion. Again, here in the United States, the action level in the EPA is at 4.0. So should we not worry about it if it's at 3.8? Well, we'll talk a little bit more about the numbers in a minute, but it is something to be aware of. And also some of these others, I taught this class, and a few months later, one of the agents that was in the class called me and said, hey, I have this listing. The buyers did a free radon test, but based on your class, I don't think they did the test correctly. And sure enough, I went out, and so he said, I want you to just come and retest for the seller. So I went back and retested. Sure enough, it was the wrong type of testing equipment, done in the wrong location, not set up at the correct height, not set up. There's all these protocols that you have to follow for it to be a valid test. And they struck out like 4 times as far as, not hitting all of those protocols that you're supposed to have for a valid test. So you do want to be cautious with some of those free tests, and just being educated and educating your clients, and especially if you have rentals, educating your tenants that way.
Hey, Jared, there is a
yep.
question in the chat.
Let's
From
see.
Brenda.
Yes, levels be different on weather. Yes, let me hold that thought, because we are going to talk about some of the other things that can affect radon levels. So hold that thought. Weather can affect it, time of year can affect it, and some other parameters. So hold that thought when we get into the testing and talk about some of those protocols. We'll talk about some of those other things that can skew the results. and why different testing procedures can help minimize that. But definitely good question. So one thing that as agents helping clients and when you're negotiating, especially a radon issue, there's some very interesting data when it comes to people who have smoked or people who have never smoked. And the distinction, at least with a lot of the data, it doesn't really correlate to people who are currently smokers, but the data actually is even if you've ever smoked. So you had a bad smoking habit through high school, you're in that higher risk category when it comes to the synergistic effect between radon and smoking. So let me show you some of the numbers here. So here is some of the data that the EPA has put together based on studies. And what they're trying to say is, and it's just like any other cancer. You can't say, oh, well, if you have this and this, you're going to get cancer. You know, if you smoke 4 cigarettes for this many days, you're going to have, everybody's immune system is different. There's so many environmental factors that are different. So this is really just the best we can do as far as giving some risk, the correlation and what the numbers really mean. So if you look at that 4 picocuries, it says about 62 people, if they're exposed to 4 picocuries for most of their lifetime, that 62 out of 1,000 are going to get lung cancer. And just, and you could say die of lung cancer because once you're diagnosed with lung cancer, the chance that you survive that for any significant amount of time is really low. So getting lung cancer and dying from lung cancer are often synonymous in a lot of these studies. So and then if you look at, they try to correlate that and compare that to something that people could relate to. Because is that a lot? Is that, I don't know. But if you say it's 5 times the risk of dying in a car crash, okay, people can understand that. So put that into perspective. You're helping a client. They've had a habit of smoking and they're buying a house and it has 4 picocuries. Well, that would be like saying, okay, I'm going to sell you this car. Just know that you're 5 times more likely to die in this car than in your other car. A lot of people are going to take pause and go, okay, I'm going to rethink this. And oh, by the way, you can have it mitigated and take care of that risk. Yeah, that's a no-brainer. So compare that risk number to if you've never smoked and it drops down to just, it's the risk of dying in a car crash. So the reason why I want to highlight this is I've had experiences with clients and with agents and negotiations where, well, it's 3.9 and we really want this mitigated. Well, a 3.5 for a smoker is way more risky than even like a 5 or a 6 for a non-smoker. So again, it all comes back to, and maybe that person has a history of lung cancer in their family and their genetics, then heck yeah, I want to get a radon system, so just be sensitive to those things. I'm not here to say whether it's right or wrong, whether you should, and is 5 really that risky? That's not really our place, but just so that you understand a little bit more when you are representing your clients to know where they're coming from. And so maybe if the buyer is really pushing for this and the seller, that's usually the case where I see it is the seller's like, I don't have to do this. It's not above 4. Well, you don't have to really do anything in Utah for negotiations. There's no requirement. Anything's negotiable. So just keep that in mind. Another way just to look at this that I think is always interesting is if you look at the 10 picocuries, it's 20 times the risk of dying in a home fire if you've never smoked, or 200 times the risk if you were a smoker. And you think about, we find a lot of homes that are in that 10 picocurie range. And you think of how many people are paranoid about having smoke detectors in their home, yet, again, this just kind of emphasizes that we have a lot of radon in Utah, and not testing for radon or not really paying attention to it, in some cases can be way more risky than not having any working smoke detectors in your home. All right, there is your second keyword. All right. Okay, we've kind of gone through that. So what are the levels and where does Utah fit in with all of this? So this was probably about 20 years ago, 20 or 30 years ago. They put together these zone maps. And the whole idea was they wanted to take the data they had and they wanted to break it out by county and show which counties had a risk for radon. Basically, yellow said it's pretty low risk. Orange, yeah, a decent risk. Red, yeah, you definitely have a radon risk. The issue was, if you look at Utah, that's kind of what we went off of for a long time. And especially, when I started doing inspections, that was the data that was available. And people just, yeah, I don't really worry about radon too much. Well, the problem is we didn't have a whole lot of data back when this was done in the early 90s. But then in the 90s is when you started seeing a lot more testing done. A lot more people could get the little do-it-yourself kits. We'll talk about those in a minute. But what it is with those kits go to just a few labs around the country. And those labs grab all the data and they send it to the state health departments. And so over the last 15 years, we've been able to summarize all that data for Utah. So we have a very large data set. And the numbers are that here in Utah, so this was about 10 years ago, they recreated this map, built it the same way, but just using accurate data. And they made one more change. They said, yeah, if we don't have enough data, we're not going to guess, which is what the EPA did. And those are the gray counties. But you can see pretty much most of the state is in that red category. And the numbers are, if you are in Utah statewide, 1 in 3 homes tends to test high. Here in Utah County and Salt Lake counties, those are also about the same numbers. It's about 1 in 3 homes. So a lot more significant than a lot of people realize. This is just another interesting, the Utah Geological Survey. You can search, and they have a high resolution PDF that you can download. Basically what they did, where this information is going off of actual tests that were done, they put together a map saying what's the likelihood based on the geology that an area is going to have a radon problem. And at least with my experiences over the years, it's pretty accurate. So the areas where we tend to see more radon than others is along the bench. So anywhere along the Wasatch Front, there's a lot of radon in the mountains. And so the other areas that we see that, if you think of, there's a lot of radon in the mountains, but then it's also water soluble, can be carried in water. Any of those river bottom areas, any of those valleys, mouths of canyons. So like, again, I'm more familiar with Utah County. So Provo River bottoms, there's a whole community at the mouth of Hobble Creek Canyon down in Spanish Fork. All of those homes always test high and have issues. You can almost draw a line from American Fork Canyon, the mouth of American Fork Canyon, to the north end of Utah Lake. And that whole area we tend to see more radon in that area. Another area, probably the biggest hot spot in the areas that I service, is Saratoga Springs, around the Springs area. So we've actually had a few homes in kind of the original Saratoga Springs that we had one that was 130 picocuries. We had another one that was 150 picocuries. So those are definite hot spots. You might as well be consuming multiple packs of cigarettes a day when you look at the risk factors for lung cancer. Okay, so let's talk about testing. See how, okay. Radon tests are easy, they're inexpensive. There's really no reason that homeowners shouldn't be testing. In fact, the EPA recommends that every homeowner should test their home every 2 years, whether they have a system or not. They should be testing every 2 years. And part of that is because geology changes, water tables change. Look at the water tables this year compared to 4 or 5 years ago. So different things can be happening in the ground. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but the radon tests are inexpensive, they're easy to do, and they're fairly reliable. So you have short-term testing and long-term testing. The long-term testing is really the way to go if you want an accurate test. It's 90 days or longer. So it's usually 91 to 365 days is the duration for a long-term test. The problem is, especially in real estate, that doesn't really fly to do a test that long. So they came up with the short-term test, and they've been doing that for about 25 years. And I have a few examples here. Well, I'll just kind of walk through some of these. So electorate, that is a type of device. It's pretty much just for professionals because it's pretty expensive. There's only a couple of companies that I'm aware of. One of them is one of these mitigation companies that does a lot of free testing. This is actually a valid test. They know what they're doing. They're one of the ones that, you know, that if I hear, oh yeah, they did the test, it's probably fairly accurate. They know what they're doing. The charcoal, these are the ones that are going to be the most likely that you'll find. So I think this is one. I don't know if you can see my screen. I'm sharing the screen here. Let's see.
We can see you. We can see.
Okay,
what
if you can see it here. So
Uh-huh.
these, I think this was like one at Home Depot or Walmart. You can just get off a big box store. This one is the kind that this is the kind, I think this is still the same kind that they'll do with, it's the one that's on the screen with, if you go to radon.utah.gov is the state's radon resource. And you can order these kits. So it's about $15. I would recommend doing it that way rather than going to a big box store. So one of the things that can affect radon results is if your testing equipment isn't stored properly and maintained. And so they're very specific with these types of short-term tests that they have to be stored. They have a certain shelf life. They can't be stored in certain temperatures and certain humidity. And you have no quality control checks when you buy something off the shelf at a big box store. Ordering from radon.utah.gov, then you know you're getting a good test kit. Basically, inside is charcoal substance. Charcoal is like a big sponge when it comes to gases, and it just absorbs everything that's floating around in the air. So if you can see on that picture, there's a little clock. So basically, you're just writing down the date and time when you open it up, and then you just leave it usually for 72 hours, and then you close it up, and it's already postage paid, prepaid. You just mail it into the lab, and then they'll email you over the results. I've seen some other variations of this. Some of them are like a little bit more of a plastic container that has a bunch of charcoal. I mean, so there's a few different variations, but it's all the same concept. Let's see, pros and cons. Let me just talk about some of the other types here. This is a professional monitor. So this is one of the ones that we use. It's an electronic device. So as it's set up, it wakes up once an hour, and it will sample the air and find out how much radioactivity is in the air, and you get a result that way. These are professional, some of the different professional testers or equipment that you'll see with home inspectors. Pros and cons between the professional equipment versus the charcoal kits. Charcoal kits are going to be cheaper, $15, maybe $20 a piece. Are they accurate? Fairly accurate. You do have to understand some of their limitations. One of those limitations is, as I mentioned earlier, a half-life of radon is about 2.5 days. So when you are measuring radon in this way, you're absorbing the radon, you're sending it off to the lab, and then they're extracting it and measuring it. But if radon has a 2.5 day half-life, that means, and you run the test for 3 days, that means that some of the radon that was absorbed on day 1 has already decayed and is no longer there. And then you mail it you send it off in the mail, especially if it's over a weekend or a holiday weekend, by the time it gets there. So it's not a true average when you're using the charcoal test, because you're getting it a little skewed towards the end. And as you see some of I'll show you some different reports. Radon is not linear. It goes all over the place, highs and lows, and can affect different things. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So advantages of the do-it-yourself: they're cheap, they're easy to do. You can get decent results. I usually tell my clients, look, if the result comes in below 3, you're good. If it comes back above 5, know that you probably have a problem. If it comes in between 3 and 5 and you're trying to decide if you're over or above 4, yeah, there's a little bit of margin of error and you might want to do a few more just to confirm. Just so you know, this is one of those tests that you see a lot of the companies doing as a free test kit. The RADON protocol, the protocol that the EPA established, that is if it's a part of a real estate transaction and you're using this type of device, a charcoal device, you must do 2 of them for it to be a valid test. So either 2 together that are averaged or 2 consecutively. So you set up one, pick it up, send it off, start another one, pick it up, send it off, and you average those 2 results. So technically, if it's part of a real estate transaction, it has to be 2 passive devices like this. I'm just gonna kind of get on my soapbox about professionals and professional equipment. There are other types of electronic devices that are sold and they work great. They're not considered professional equipment. So these are some of the more consumer-based. They work great. That one up on the top left, made by Air Things. I have one of those in my house. They're great. It tells me I have it set up in my basement, and at any time I can go down and look and I can see the long-term average. So what it's been over the last 3 months. I can see the 7-day average, and then it switches over and it gives me the daily average. That's been really helpful for me too, just in this profession, to see how much things change. Before I go down that tangent. So these are consumer-based devices. And I guess my soapbox is that oftentimes I will see other home inspectors that are performing professional services using this kind of equipment. And these devices are not meant for professional testing. In fact, the manufacturers, this is the gray one. Corentium is the company that makes that, Air Things. The yellow one down on the bottom, that's the professional device. Those run about $1,200 to $1,500. The gray one runs about $100 to $150. So just from a professional standpoint, charging people $100 to do a test with a device that you really shouldn't be using professionally and charging about the cost of the device, just protect your clients and make sure that they're getting what they're paying for. This is another one that same type of thing. Even the manufacturer says, this should not be a substitute for a professional test. This was one of the agents that I work a lot with. This was on her listing. The buyer had a professional radon test done, and this was the radon report. I've covered up, basically that was a business card for the home inspector. And it was just, yep, here's your result. Yep, it's high. And he basically took a picture of the device, which is not meant for professional testing. The reasons why they're not meant for professional testing is they're just not rated to be bouncing around in a truck all day and then set up. They don't have that sensitivity. The professional equipment, like you see here, professional standards are that you have to send off this equipment annually to a lab where they expose it to a measured amount of radon and they calibrate the equipment. So you can see why it would be appealing to a new home inspector. I'm going to go buy one of these devices for $150 and start charging $100 to do a radon test instead of spending $1,500 on this device, and then every year I have to send it off. That costs me $250 per device per year. So there's a lot more overhead to do it professionally and do it accurately. So that's my soapbox. Just make sure you're protecting your clients, and if they're getting inspections, make sure that the inspector is actually using the appropriate equipment to protect your clients. Oh, there's your third keyword. So this is a professional device, should give you some results. And as you can see from these different graphs, radon goes all over the place. And so that's where it's, especially with a radon, with a real estate transaction, having a professional device where you can see this can alert you to other things. So again, pros and cons, the charcoal ones, they're cheap and they give you fairly decent results, but it does take a little bit longer. You're about a week turnaround time to get results. Where a professional device, you can usually get those results in less than 3 days. And they're more expensive. That's the downside. But you also in a real estate transaction will be clued into any tampering. So like on this one, you can see those red dots up at the top of the graph. Those are motion sensors. So most of these devices have built-in motion sensors to tell you if it was tampered with. Luckily, it's only happened to me a couple times in my career where you'll have really high readings and then a motion sensor, and then all of a sudden it's really low readings. And then, oh, yep, the home inspector's coming back on Monday. So they could throw a blanket over the top of it. They might pick it up and set it outside. They might move it to a different location. So we would want to be clued into that. And so that's another advantage of a professional test. You can see in this one where, once a device is kind of getting acclimated in a property, most standards, most professional equipment will omit the first 4 hours. So you can see on almost all of these devices, those first few hours are pretty low. And that's because the device is just getting acclimated to its environment before it actually starts registering and taking those measurements. So that's, another feature with those professional equipment. So let's talk about some things that can affect the radon results. So again, the house type can affect it, but there's weather and temperature, seasons that can affect radon a lot. And so if you take into consideration that radon is a gas that's coming out of the ground, I would say one of the biggest factors where we see changes or big swings in some of these radon results is going to be weather patterns and barometric pressure. So whenever we see a huge dramatic change like this one, where it started up in almost into the 30s and then dropped down into the 4s, I look at weather data and I can see a direct inverse correlation with barometric pressure. So if barometric pressure is going up, radon levels are going to go down. So if all of a sudden we see a huge rise in barometric pressure, that means we just saw a huge rise in radon. We see a huge drop in barometric pressure. So again, is it a valid test result? Yes, it's still valid, but for this one, for example, the minimum amount of time is 48 hours for a radon test. Well, if you look at this result, this one ran for about 3 days. If we had run the last 48 hours, we're barely at that 4.0 average. If we run it for the full time, we're actually at a 5.0 average. If we just did the first 48 hours, I don't have the number on here, but it was in the teens. So just depending on some of those things. So we've had cases where the radon test comes back high for the buyer, the seller orders another radon test and it comes back low. And then they ask, well, which one's valid? Which one's right? Well, if they were done correctly, they both are. That's where it's really important. I've had a number of those where then the seller comes back or the buyer, and we'll look at the equipment they use. Well, was it a professional equipment? Has it been calibrated recently? Is it a valid test? Because they're both valid tests if they're using the right equipment and it's been calibrated and it was set up properly. You have other things that can factor in. So some other things just to be aware of. If you have sub-slab ducting, so every time the heater kicks on, it's actually pulling more gases from the ground and blowing them into the house. And so we've seen lots of things going up and down with like this one. When the ground is saturated, when you have a lot of rainfall, the ground is wet. And so radon can't come up through your lawn. It's going to be forced into your house. So some studies have shown that radon that gets into your house is usually from the footprint of your house plus 4 feet. So it's not like it's coming from the neighbor's yard. It's coming from your direct property, the footprint of your house. But if that's all saturated, if you just change landscaping, that can affect radon in the home. If there's a lot of landscaping and excavation and geological changes on the lot next door to yours, that could affect the radon levels in your home. So that goes back to what I said earlier. That's why the EPA recommends every home should be tested every 2 years. Okay, just real quick, these are some of the parameters. you have to maintain closed house conditions. So during a short-term test, we have to keep all windows and doors closed. No normal entry and exit through the main door is fine, but like window air conditioners, swamp coolers, those can't be used during a radon test. You want the device in an occupiable level of the home, at least 20 inches above the floor, not in kitchens or bathrooms. Usually it should be like a living room or a bedroom, not in utility rooms. You don't want it underneath an air register because that's not passive airflow. That's getting all of the air blowing out of the furnace, and that's just going to skew the results. So there is also a distinction between a real estate transaction and a non-real estate transaction. And some of the current language has more to do with urgent or non-urgent test results. But basically, the original EPA protocol said that if it's a non-real estate transaction and you do a short-term test and it's between 4 and 10, then you should do another long-term test to confirm those results. If it's above 10, then you can do another short-term test to confirm those results. However, if it's a real estate transaction, none of that applies. If it's a valid test and it's 4.0 or greater, remediation is recommended. So sometimes we'll get into that, and that's something to be aware of if you do a lot of property management, is if it's not part of a real estate transaction, then technically the short-term test, you should verify that with a long-term test. But if it's a real estate transaction, you don't need to do that as long as it was done properly. So I get that every once in a while. A seller will say, well, you didn't come out and do a second test. Well, it's a real estate transaction, that doesn't apply. 4.0 is the action level. That's where remediation is recommended. So at least for my company, our policy is we just follow EPA standards. If it's 4.0, we recommend remediation. If it's 3.9, we tell them, that it's below the action level, but then the EPA also says you may wish to consider remediation when it's between 2 and 4. Remediation should get it below 2. So those are some of the discussions we'll have with the client. In most cases, we'll recommend that they do a long-term test. And I forgot to talk about long-term tests. This is a long-term test device. If people ask me, like a homeowner calls me and says, well, I want to know if I have radon, we can go and do a professional test, but actually these long-term test kits are more reliable than our professional equipment. These are a minimum of 91 days up to 365 days. I recommend people do them at least 6 months. Try to go through a few different seasons because your living habits are going to be different. Maybe during the summer or the spring and the fall, you always sleep with your windows open. Then during the summer, you have the AC cranked and you can't ever get your kids to close the door. In the wintertime, you're super sealed up and closed up. Those are different parameters that are going to affect the radon levels throughout. So I would say these run about $30 to $50. So the same type of thing, you open them up, just put them, but you don't have any of these, got to have the windows. You just live your life normally. After that time period, you seal it back up, you mail it off to the lab and you get the results. So if you're really just concerned with what the overall level is in your home, these are called alpha track or just long-term testers. And you can also get those from radon.utah.gov. If you're impatient, then that's where the professional test might make a little more sense. There is your fourth keyword. And we're wrapping up. We're just going to talk about mitigation real quick to wrap up. So the bottom line is average cost is probably in the last year or two, it's probably closer to $1,500 to get a home remediated. So it's not crazy. I do have to say that is a slab on grade or a basement home. If you have a crawl space, I would plan on almost doubling that. Crawl spaces tend to run a lot more money just because there's a lot more work to seal up that crawl space to keep the radon out of the home. What are they doing? They're basically sealing up any gaps or cracks anywhere where they can see. So if it's a finished basement, there's not a whole lot they can do. But then what they're doing is they're providing an alternate path for the radon to go from the ground out of the house rather than through the house. So here's kind of a picture of what it might look like. In most cases, they're going to cut a hole in the slab. They're going to dig out a little bit of the gravel and the dirt underneath and kind of create an air pocket, put a pipe into the ground. run that pipe through the house and vent it above the roof. And then you can't see it in this picture, but you would have an inline fan that is running 24/7, 365 and sucking the air out of the ground and venting it out of the house. So all you're doing is you're creating, remember we talked about the stack effect, it creates a negative pressure or a suction in the lowest level. You're creating another lower level that has even more of a negative pressure or a suction that draws that radon up and out. One of the other questions I often get is, well, we're building a new house. Can we test it? No, there's no way to test a home and know if it's going to have radon until the home is complete. Contractors can install a passive system. So basically that's what this is basically it's everything except for the fan. And that's what a lot of builders will do and save a little bit of money by not putting the fan in. However, when you just play the numbers, a lot of these communities, the builders are like, yeah, I'm not sending someone back out to put in a $300 fan, just put in the fan, wire it up, and now we're good. We have a system. An active system or a system with a fan usually reduces radon levels by about 90%. A passive system, about 70% reduces the radon levels. Radon.utah.gov also has a list of approved, some of the national accreditations for radon mitigators. So make sure you have someone that knows what they're doing. We've had homes where the seller was a contractor and is going to put in the radon system. And we went back and retested and it didn't solve the problem. We've actually had a few builders that have specialized ventilation systems and they sell them as radon systems, but those aren't technically radon mitigation systems. So again, just making sure your clients and protecting your clients that they're getting what they're paying for and what they're expecting. State radon hotline. That phone number there, that's the best resource, or just radon.utah.gov. I forgot to mention radon.utah.gov. You can go to that website and they have a list of all of the data. So you can look at by zip code, what's all the tests that have been done and what's the average radon level for that actual zip code throughout the state. So it's a good resource when you're just helping your clients understand. I think we're out of time, but Tana, I can't remember if we did 4 or 5 keywords.
We just did 4, but
Okay. So you can ignore the 5th one. Any questions, anyone? Okay.
that's great. Thank you.
Make sure you fill out that form and reach out if you have any questions, if there's anything we can help with.
Thank you so much, as always, Jared.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll stay on for a minute. Oh, they're all off. Okay. Okay.
Short, sweet. Okay. Thanks, Tana.